Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where these videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. If you've not already done so, please silence your phone. Remember the model town and trains of Possum Ridge are upstairs through December 31st. It's a fun solo or ensemble outing my family visits every year. Eudora Welty's birthday was April 13th, and anytime the 13th falls on a day the Welty House is open, as it will this month, tours of the house and garden are free. If you're interested in taking advantage of that, it's a good idea to call or email the Welty House to reserve your spot. This program wraps up the 20th season of History is Lunch. While I'm delighted to have made it to this milestone, I can assure you that when we began back in 2005, no one was thinking about this series in terms of decades. The department wanted to have a more active voice in the ongoing cultural life of the capital city, and Governor William Winter, who was the longtime president of the Board of Trustees, thought a speaker series might be a good way to do that. Chrissy Wilson picked up the responsibility of the series in addition to all her other work, came up with the name, and booked Suzanne Mars to talk about her then just published biography of Eudora Welty. At first, the programs were monthly. Our second speaker was April Newland, discussing her book, Horn of Plenty, Seasons in an Island Wilderness. Evan Peacock followed with Mississippi Archaeology Q&A, and our own Grady Howell gave a November presentation on the history of Thanksgiving in Mississippi. That month, we transitioned to a bi-weekly schedule, and we went through the year with programs on the state's Victorian homes, quilting across generations, Ernest Herndon's book, Paddling the Pascagoula, Jim Hollinsworth's look at African Americans in the Union Army, and we closed with Stuart Rockoff's presentation, The Fall and Rise of the Jewish South, 1945 to 2005. We picked back up in the new year with another MDAH librarian, Joyce Dixon Lawson, and a presentation on how to do African American genealogy. By the early summer of 2009, we started to have a History's Lunch program every week, beginning with Ken Carlton and his presentation on the Choctaw Indians, and Vince Venturini's History of Public Welfare in Mississippi. We carried on with programs in the Winter Building's community room, moving to the old Capitol House chamber when we expected a larger crowd than we could accommodate there. Chrissy retired from MDAH, but continued to coordinate History's Lunch until the end of 2014, and around that time, the department began planning for these new museums. When they opened, we were able to move History's Lunch into this fantastic space we enjoy today, with plenty of room for everyone, good sound and video support, the ability to live stream so that folks who can't make it to downtown Jackson at noon on a Wednesday can still participate, and much to the dismay of several spouses of faithful attendees, Chuck Bierman, a museum store to facilitate the sale of books when a speaker has one, as they do today. History's Lunch will pick back up January 22nd with a presentation by museum staff on Martin Luther King Jr. in Mississippi, so put that on your calendars. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Ryan Semmes to present Exporting Reconstruction, Ulysses Grant and a New Empire of Liberty. Ryan Semmes is a professor at the Mississippi State University Libraries, where he serves as Director of Research for the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. He earned his BA in History from Mississippi State University, his MA in Public History, and his MLIS from the University of South Carolina, and his PhD in History from Mississippi State. Semmes is the author of the new book, Exporting Reconstruction, Ulysses S. Grant and a New Empire of Liberty. Help me welcome him to the stage.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate you having me. I appreciate MDAH having me. And I wasn't aware that I was the final of the 20th anniversary presentation, so I hope I live up to that kind of expectation. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some excerpts from my book, Ulysses S. Grant, and a New Empire of Liberty, Exporting Reconstruction. And in particular, I'm going to talk about Grant and his Reconstruction foreign policy, but I'm also going to talk about his relationship with Hiram Revels in that foreign policy. And like he said, please buy the book. This is my first book event. So I would love for somebody to buy a copy who isn't my mother. And let's be honest, she didn't buy a copy. So on March 4th, 1869, it was a gloomy, rainy morning in Washington, D.C. The streets were crowded with soldiers, citizens, and pickpockets who, along Pennsylvania Avenue, hoped to catch a glimpse of the procession that made its way to the Capitol. Thankfully, by mid-morning, the clouds parted and all the umbrellas were put away, and the starting gun was fired, and people along windows and rooftops and balconies on the street as the street teemed with onlookers, hoped to catch a glimpse of their president-elect, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant and his predecessor, Andrew Johnson, hated one another. Grant worked for Johnson, and for all the rumors that Grant was a drunk, Johnson really was one. And Grant couldn't stand him, and Johnson couldn't stand him back. And so the inaugural committee decided they needed to put them in separate carriages along the route. But at the last minute, President Johnson said, "No, thank you," and left town, foregoing the procession and the inaugural ceremony and just adding one more disappointment to his political career. Grant instead traveled with his military staff. He was accompanied along the route by over a dozen military regiments, by firemen, by the Supreme Court, members of the House and Senate, veterans of the Mexican-American War, which Grant was a veteran of as well, and 30 veterans of the War of 1812. When the procession reached the cabinet, the members of the Senate, the House, the cabinet, and the Supreme Court all entered the Senate chamber and took their seats. Grant's father, Jesse Grant, a man who never thought his son would amount to much and was extremely happy to be sitting there that day. Jesse Grant sat next to Senator James Nye of Nevada, waiting for his son to enter the chamber, and Vice President-elect Schuyler Colfax then took the oath of office and made a short speech. Now the president of the Senate, Vice President Schuyler Colfax, then administered the oath to all of the newly elected senators and led the group to the platform outside. So Grant's appearance outside led to multiple rounds of cheers from the crowd that was gathered. He was the victorious general of the Civil War. Once the Chief Justice administered the oath, he was now President Grant, and he began his inaugural address in, quote, a clear but not very loud tone. The address mostly focused on the enormous cost of the Civil War, both in men and in treasure. And Grant promised the American people that he would be honest about his policies, right? Conveying them to the Congress and to the people, and that he understood the enormity of the position that he was accepting. Quote, "The young men of the country have a peculiar interest in maintaining the national honor," Grant noted to the crowd. Quote, "A moment's reflection as to what will be our commanding influence among the nations of the earth in their day should inspire them with national pride." So at this moment, Grant is recognizing, and there's Grant in the center there. It's kind of hard to see, but this is 1869. In this moment, Grant recognized that the United States was entering a new era, one where the promises of liberty, the promises of national honor, put the United States on equal footing with all of the rest of the countries of the world. This new era meant the coming together of all citizens, old and new, into a, quote, common sentiment that would cross, quote, all divisions, geographical, political, and religious. So Grant's plain language and directness pleased one editor of the local newspaper, the National Republican, who told his readers, quote, "How wonderfully he possesses the faculty of reaching the popular heart through these brief but pungent appeal to its judgment and the sense of right and wrong." And towards the end of his speech, Grant appealed to Americans to consider the rights of all citizens of the United States, whether they are natural-born, newly freed, or naturalized immigrants, and what their place in the world would be. Quote, "In regard to foreign policy, I would deal with nations as equitable law requires individuals to deal with one another. And I would protect the law-abiding citizen, whether native or of foreign birth, wherever his rights are jeopardized or wherever our flag of our country floats. I would respect the rights of all nations, but I demand equal respect for our own. If others depart from this rule in their dealings with us, we may be compelled to follow their precedent." As Grant spoke these words about immigrants and foreign policy, both Great Britain and Spain held under arrest American citizens, both native-born American citizens and naturalized immigrants. These immigrants were being held under arrest for their political activities in places like the Caribbean, Canada, and Ireland. These American citizens, who many of whom were veterans of the Civil War, then took these notions of liberty with them back to their homelands to, quote, free their oppressed brothers and sisters where they were placed under arrest. So as a result, the new administration had to pursue international agreements that would define what an American citizen was in the world and how its intended rights were held on behalf of its citizens. So foreign powers, Grant argued, were required to respect the sovereignty of the United States and respect its citizens no matter where they roamed. Yet many of these American citizens were aiding rebellions against sovereign nations, which not only violated the laws of those nations, but violated the laws of the United States. So needless to say, as soon as he gets into office, he's left with this conundrum in his lap from the Johnson administration. The actions of certain naturalized citizens forced the Grant administration to redefine exactly how the United States would respond to citizens inciting rebellion in other lands. And the question of how to do this ends up dominating a good part of Grant's foreign policy during his first term. Now, he also used the occasion of his inaugural address to promote his ideas about who should be included in the Republican experiment, who should be a citizen. And towards the end of the address, he mentioned the plight of Native Americans. And for the first time for any American president, outlined a path to citizenship for Native Americans. Quote, "The proper treatment of the original occupants of the land, the Indian, is one deserving of careful study," he said to the crowd. "I will favor any course towards them which tends to their civilization, Christianization, and ultimate citizenship." So Grant's short statement encapsulated his Republican ideology. He had a colorblind faith that men who were once civilized and faithful Christians and accepted the norms of Western civilization could assimilate into Republican society. They would be welcome as citizens of the United States. They could vote, they could serve on juries, they could do everything a citizen does. Indigenous populations, though, at this time are sovereign nations, but that mattered very little to Grant. He believed all civilized people who dwelled within the borders of the United States were Americans and therefore were subject to the blessings, as he sees, of the Constitution. He claimed that he sought to end violence against Native Americans, and one of the ways he did so was by placing his friend, Ulysses S. Parker, as the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Parker, a chief of the Seneca tribe of New York, and a member of Grant's staff during the Civil War. By placing him in this position, Grant hoped to show that a, quote, civilized Native American would accept Republican institutions of the United States. Parker is actually, before the war, more successful than Grant. Parker is the highest and only Native American person in the government during the Grant administration. He's the first member of a sub-cabinet position who is not a white person in American history, right? So Grant hopes to hold him up as an example of what a Native American citizen is, right? So Native Americans could accept these Republican institutions, and for Grant, once Native Americans had fully embraced the trappings of civilization, assimilated into the culture of the United States, their citizenship would be guaranteed, as would be their prosperity. So Grant saw the Reconstruction era as a time when people who were long left out of the Republican experiment in the United States could finally enjoy these blessings of liberty, right? Nevertheless, he still held to 19th century concepts of Western civilization that considered Native American culture as uncivilized, right? So until they stopped acting like Native Americans, they couldn't be citizens of the United States. So he's asking them to stop being themselves. But once the Native Americans accepted these Republican norms, they assimilated into Western culture, as his friend Ely Parker had done. Well, Grant believed that the United States should count them as equal to any man who walked the streets of the United States. Grant ended his first inaugural address with a plea to the American people to support the newest citizens of the nation, African Americans. Quote, "The question of suffrage is one which is likely to agitate the public, so long as a portion of the citizens of this nation are excluded from its privileges in any state. It seems to me very desirable that the question should be settled now, and I entertain the hope and express the desire that it may be by the ratification of the 15th Article of Amendment to the Constitution." The 15th Amendment to the Constitution stated that, quote, "The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." This permitted all former male enslaved African Americans, free African Americans, naturalized citizens of color, and if Grant's ideas were successful, Native Americans, to have the right to vote in all elections. So for Grant, the 15th Amendment was the epitome of the Constitution's core values of liberty and freedom, right? Alongside the 13th and the 14th Amendment, the 15th fulfills the promise of our nation's founding. Grant wrote that the ratification of the 15th Amendment, quote, "completes the greatest civil change and constitutes the most important event ever since the nation came into life." So Grant understood that the American Civil War had fundamentally changed the United States. He changed the United States into a nation that was finally living up to the ideals of its founding. Quote, "There's been no event since the close of the war in which I've felt so deep an interest as that of the ratification of this amendment," Grant told a group of reporters outside of the White House. "I have felt the greatest anxiety ever since I've been in this house to know that the 15th would be secured. It looks to me as the realization of the Declaration of Independence." So African Americans were enjoying freedom and citizenship through the ratification of these Reconstruction amendments, and Grant hoped to export the ideas of Reconstruction and republicanism throughout the Western Hemisphere. So this policy, which in my book I call the Grant Doctrine, spurred Grant's attempts to annex the Dominican Republic as a territory to the United States, with a path to statehood, where he would guarantee citizenship rights to the Dominicans and offer that island as a haven for African Americans who are fleeing the violence of the South and the former Confederacy. The Grant Doctrine envisioned massive political and social change in the Western Hemisphere. Grant saw the United States as the leader of emancipation, civilization, and republicanism throughout the hemisphere. The United States would strangle slavery out of the region, he argued, not by going to war, but by using Republican ideology and economics to do so. He believed that indigenous populations and people of color in the Caribbean were ready to become citizens of the United States alongside the millions of newly freed African Americans. The Grant Doctrine then envisioned an expansion of U.S. territory, but also an expansion of the values of free labor, economic stability, and freedom. President Grant articulated the Grant Doctrine in a memorandum that he wrote in late 1869, probably about December 31st, December 30th, 1869. He unfortunately did not date it, which drives me insane. And this memorandum contains his thoughts about considering annexing the Dominican Republic, and it's fittingly titled "Reasons Why We Should Annex the Dominican Republic," or San Domingo should be annexed. This memorandum encapsulates Grant's policy of exporting Reconstruction Republican ideology. Grant wrote this memorandum shortly after the death of his friend and former Secretary of War, John Rawlins, who was a supporter of intervention in the Caribbean, particularly in Cuba, and after the death of Edwin Stanton, the former Secretary of War, who in the span of 4 days, Grant nominates Stanton to the Supreme Court. The next day, Stanton is voted into the Supreme Court by the United States Senate. The next day, Stanton dies. And the next day, Grant writes his memorandum about annexing the Dominican Republic. So it was a rough Christmas time because it's late December. It's a pretty rough Christmas in the White House. So he crafts this memo while he's undergoing a little bit of grief over some friends. But he hoped the annexation of the Dominican Republic, or as they called it often back then, Santo Domingo, would allow the United States to divest itself from the slave society of Cuba. Because at this time, the main supplier of all tropical goods to the United States is Cuba, which means the United States is the single greatest supporter of slavery in the world, because in 1869, all of those tropical goods in Cuba are being produced with slave labor. This is the reasons why memo. Again, it's even up, there's a date spot up there. He could have put it, yeah. Anyway, it drives me crazy. So the Grant Doctrine differed from the Monroe Doctrine, which you all have heard about, in that previous presidents had utilized Monroe's doctrine during a period when the United States was a slaveholding republic, right? The Monroe Doctrine then, in the post-Civil War era, was worthy of re-examination. The Grant Doctrine, however, represents a new philosophy towards the Western Hemisphere than the Monroe Doctrine. The United States would not be the purveyor of slavery, right, as it was in the time before the Civil War, but an exemplar of emancipation, how to emancipate the enslaved. He intended to assert American influence in the region by acquiring military bases in the Caribbean. These military bases would put the United States in a position of naval dominance. Then he would assert control over the shipping lanes, exercise influence over the remaining European colonies, and strangle slavery out of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Brazil. This was his plan. However, the Grant Doctrine also sought to incorporate the people of the Caribbean into the electorate, into the body of the United States, and to welcome the people of the neighboring slaveholding islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico to come to the Dominican Republic and become citizens of the United States, to come to this beacon of American freedom as he saw it. So Grant's doctrine took its cues from the Reconstruction amendments. The 13th Amendment, end slavery. The 14th Amendment, citizenship. And the 15th Amendment, to provide votes. He wants to provide all of these concepts of American liberty to the people of the Caribbean, make them American citizens, and hopefully make them members of the Republican Party. So his plan for Santo Domingo was to export these citizenship rights to the Dominican people, build up their economy with free labor, and in doing so, gradually strangle slavery. But citizenship is the key tenet of the Grant Doctrine. Grant hopes that through annexation, the Dominican Republic will become a state. So the people who live in the Dominican Republic will send senators and congressmen to the Congress. They'll elect a governor. And if it's a state, American citizens can move there freely, allowing American citizens to go there to make their fortunes in the fertile land of this island nation which has tons of land and very few people, right? And it would provide the Dominican people the right to live and work throughout the United States as well. Dominicans can leave the Dominican Republic and go live anywhere in the United States. Why? Because they're citizens. He took note to focus on African Americans, though, as the people best suited for that territory. So Grant drew on the race-based biology of his day that said that African Americans were best suited for the Caribbeans and not whites. So Grant believed that African Americans would find the climate of the Caribbean congenial, but he also believed they would want to leave the South, escape the oppressive white supremacy of the former Confederates, escape the violence that he thought was going to be inevitable as they exercised their rights to vote and to live as citizens. Quote, Santo Domingo is capable of supporting the entire Black population of the United States should it choose to move there. The present difficulty in bringing all parts of the United States to a happy unity and love of country grows out of prejudice of color. This prejudice is a senseless one, but it exists, Grant wrote. So Grant understood the hostility of former Confederates toward African Americans might last for many years, but economic realities would mitigate those conditions. He believed that if the Black man cannot be spared or supplied his place in the South, he could go to a place like the Dominican Republic, and the whites in the South would soon miss him and miss his labor and miss his ability to stimulate the economy, right? So he thinks that African Americans would do better in the South, and then once they leave, whites would miss them. He has the same concept about Chinese immigrants as well. He wants to put a 10-year moratorium on Chinese immigration in his mind because he wants to show people how much work they actually do. And if they're not here to do the work anymore, everything will crumble, and then you'll realize they deserve to be here and deserve a living wage. It's not a great plan, okay? So immigrating from the South seemed to Grant to be the logical move for African Americans, and he considered Santo Domingo to be an ideal location. The big problem is he never once considered that the white Southerners should get over it. This notion of individual freedom of movement, the ability of Black Americans to move around the country, is key to citizenship in the 19th century, because prior to the Civil War, African Americans were limited in their movements. They couldn't go anywhere if they were enslaved unless they had permission, and even free African Americans had certain places they couldn't go for fear of being captured into enslavement. White Americans, though, could go anywhere. After the Civil War, this, quote, right indispensable to citizenship, this right of locomotion to move, becomes central to Grant's Reconstruction policy. Because at this same time, both white and Black Americans are crossing the Mississippi River and settling in the West, right? They're settling in Kansas, Nebraska, they're going up to the Dakotas. And whose land are they settling on? Native American land that the United States is actually bound by treaty to prevent settlers from going on. And the United States is not doing that. So then Native Americans respond to these interlopers on their land with violence, and the U.S. Army responds back to the Native Americans, even though by right of treaty, they're bound to actually protect the Native Americans against the settlers. But they protect the settlers instead. So all of these things are a problem. Grant recognizes this, and he thinks the Dominican Republic will help. So in January of 1870, Grant walks across Lafayette Square to the home of Senator Charles Sumner, and where he hoped to discuss his annexation treaty, and Grant finds Sumner entertaining guests, shocker, including reporters, bigger shocker. He decides to tell him and the reporters all about his plan to annex the Dominican Republic and how important it would be to the Republican Party and to the United States. And Grant goes back to the White House thinking that Sumner has supported his treaty. Sumner says, "I never said I would support your treaty. All I said I would listen to you." One reporter says, "No, he did say he would support." The other reporter says, "No, he didn't." And from this point forward, Grant and Sumner hate each other until Sumner's dying day in 1874. Though his Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, does not support the annexation of the Dominican Republic, he doesn't tell anyone that because he's a good Secretary of State. He's not going to undermine his boss. As far as anyone knew, Fish supported the scheme, but he did try to convince the president that there were other ways to get support in the Senate for some kind of American presence in the Caribbean. Notably, he tells him that bringing the Dominicans in as a territory with a path to statehood, thereby being citizens of the United States, would sink any support in the Senate. Fish consulted with a number of senators, and they all argued that the establishment of a protectorate, where the United States Navy is around in the Caribbean and there to help any of these Caribbean nations, would be much more beneficial to the United States than annexing the Dominican Republic. So Fish argued that the genesis of Sumner's hostility to annexation was his belief that the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, of which Sumner was the chairman, Sumner thinks he's the place where foreign policy exists, even though the Constitution says the president leads foreign policy. That doesn't matter to Charles Sumner because he's Charles Sumner. The Secretary of State argued that Sumner was also angry at the way the administration negotiated the treaty for annexation, specifically because Grant sent his private secretary and former aide-de-camp, Orville Babcock, to negotiate the treaty when he had no ability, no legal right to do so, and that angered many people, including Charles Sumner. So around this time that Grant is drafting the memo, the Mississippi legislature is beginning the process to rejoin the Union, and they're selecting a newcomer to take one of the seats, Jefferson Davis's seat, in the upper chamber of Congress. And that man, as we know, is Hiram Revels. Hiram Revels, the first African American to hold a seat in the American Congress. He quickly began to work to help Grant and the Republican Party to establish a Reconstruction agenda with economic stability, civil rights for African Americans, and the concept of free labor for free men. And as Grant's foreign policy agenda gets to Congress, particularly the annexation of Santo Domingo, Revels finds himself at odds with Charles Sumner, who is his biggest supporter in the Senate. So Grant and Revels are thwarted in the desire for Santo Domingo annexation, but not before they were able to articulate its importance to the Senate and maybe to sway a few leaders in Congress and a few leaders in the African American community. So Grant was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, and his original name, Ulysses S. Grant, is not his name. His real name is Hiram Ulysses Grant. So the two Hirams. Hiram Ulysses Grant then went to West Point, where a clerical error listed him as Ulysses S. Grant, and the Army doesn't make mistakes, so that's what his name was at that point, from that point forward. So he also hated it because his initials were H-U-G, and his mother put his initials on his trunk, and so his trunk said hug, and he got made fun of a lot for that. So he sheds the name of Hiram, and this leads to all these great nicknames like Uncle Sam Grant and United States Grant, and of course, famously, Unconditional Surrender Grant. So succession and war brings opportunities for Grant. He's given a commission. He then becomes a general, rises to fame. He successfully captures 3 Confederate armies, one at Fort Donelson, one at Vicksburg, and one at Appomattox. And this swift change of fortune leads him to the Republican nomination. As an African American, Hiram Revels has a somewhat different beginning. He's born in September 1827 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He is born a free man. Revels receives a formal education at a Quaker seminary in Indiana, and he begins his job as a minister of the AME Church. He pastors to African American congregations in Maryland prior to the Civil War, and when the war breaks out, he serves as a chaplain in the U.S. Army, particularly for African American regiments under Grant at Vicksburg. So Revels is then in Mississippi at the war's end, and he moves to Natchez, where he becomes pastor of the AME Church in that community and parlays those activities into a position on the Board of Aldermen, then a position in the state Senate, where finally his fellow Republicans, both black and white, overwhelmingly elect him to the United States Senate. And his entrance into the Senate is hotly contested. There are days and days of testimony about whether he's even a citizen of the United States, whether he even qualifies to be a senator. But in the end, he's overwhelmingly supported by the Republicans and voted his seat. So by late February 1870, he's sitting in Jefferson Davis's chairs, and Jefferson Davis there as Iago cries in the corner at seeing Revels in his chair. So Revels arrived in Washington in late January, and he attended a number of dinners in his honor, one specifically a reception held by President Grant for him at the White House. He became the toast of the town for a short period of time, and then he soon settles into the drudgery of the life of a senator. But particularly, he is a freshman senator, which means at this time, he's not supposed to enter any legislation or give any speeches. Freshmen have to just sit and watch and learn. But he also understood the historic nature of his position as the first African-American member of Congress, and so he did introduce a number of petitions and pieces of legislation on behalf of citizens, many of whom, interestingly, are not Mississippians, because many African-Americans across the country see him as their representative in the Senate. And so he gets petitions from African-Americans from Georgia and from Mississippi and from Louisiana and South Carolina as well. So in his first speech before the Senate, Revels spoke out against legislation that would have allowed Georgia to rejoin the Union, because it would have meant the dissolution of the state legislature, which had an African-American majority. So Revels used this speech to lay out his vision for a post-Civil War America. African-Americans, he wrote, quote, appeal to you and to me to see that they receive that protection which alone will enable them to pursue their daily avocations with success, and enjoy the liberties of citizenship on the same footing with their white neighbors and friends. If a certain class of the South had just accepted in good faith the benevolent overtures which were offered to them, he wrote, today would not find our land still harassed with feuds and contentions. So it's during this time of Revels' first week in the Senate that Grant submits his treaty to annex the Dominican Republic, and Grant's annexation treaty is doomed the moment it gets into Congress. Unlike Grant, Revels did seek advice from Charles Sumner, and when he was giving his speech on the Georgia bill, he sent a letter to Senator Sumner saying, I think I'll deliver my speech tomorrow unless you advise me not to do so, but I would love to fix the hour when I can bring it and put the manuscript in your hands for criticism. So Revels is seeking out his colleagues. He's looking to make a name for himself, and his speech is widely covered for the press, by the press, and there's tons of dignitaries, lots of people there. And his speech had, though, articulated his philosophy as a Republican and a representative for the African American community. So clearly Revels and Sumner support the same causes, but then when the annexation treaty comes on, they take diverging paths. So at this time, Grant is trying to gain support from a constituency of like-minded Republicans, and it's unclear whether or not he showed them his memo that he wrote, but it's clear that Grant expected Republicans to support his plan because he's the leader of the Republican Party. But then Sumner's Foreign Relations Committee rejects the treaty by a vote of 5-2. And this prompts Grant to, in a rage, go to the Capitol to stump for the treaty himself, which you do not do in this time period. And Sumner is angry, and he writes to Fish, and he says, he complains about, quote, an invasion of turf that the president thinks is his own. So during the debates over the treaty, Grant's friend, Oliver P. Morton, a senator from Indiana, brings a bunch of materials that Babcock brought back from the Dominican Republic and puts them on display in the Senate chamber. And this includes things like hemp products and woods and all these kinds of things, but it also includes these large blocks of salt. And then one by one, all of these senators go down to these large blocks of salt and start licking them. And then a chaos ensues when they realize that Hiram Revels is licking one side of the salt block and the most racist Democratic Senator, Garrett Davis from Kentucky, is licking the other side of the same block. Yes. So Sumner his growing distrust of annexation seems incongruous with his lifelong support of African Americans, right? And his support of the Republican Party. And so Sumner unleashes his greatest weapon, his oratory skills, against his own president. And in a series of speeches, Sumner rails against Grant and the treaty. He questions Grant's motives in annexing Santo Domingo. He charges Grant with trying to steal the whole island, including stealing Haiti. He mocks Grant's grammar. Sumner went to Harvard. Grant's a farm boy from West Point. I think that's the deep-seated reason why they hate each other, to be honest. And he uncharacteristically, actually in this speech, disparages the intelligence of African Americans. So something's wrong with Sumner. Hamilton Fish thinks Sumner is going crazy. He thinks the residual effects from his beating prior to the Civil War by Preston S. Brooks have finally led to mental decline. I think he's right. And so about a month after the swearing in of Senator Revels, Sumner delivers this speech about Grant, and he says that Grant's acting like a despotic monarch. Quote, all this has been done by a kingly prerogative alone without the authority of an act of Congress. And that authority actually is Sumner himself. Sumner accuses Grant of acts of terrorism against the sovereign people of Santo Domingo. He argues that the president spent so much time worrying about Santo Domingo that he spent little time worrying about African Americans, and thus has allowed the rise of the Ku Klux Klan because he's spending so much time on his little scheme in the Dominican Republic. So Hiram Revels is disturbed by this speech. And in a letter he sent to the senator 2 days after, the former pastor argued that the annexation of Santo Domingo was one of Christian magnanimity, viewing, quote, the question from a Christian standpoint, that is, whether it is not our duty as a wealthy and Christian nation, regardless of the trouble or the expense which may come, to extend to institutions our various means of enlightenment and intellectual, moral, and religious elevation. This elevation with which God has blessed us to the inhabitants of the Republic, the Dominican Republic, and whether this cannot be done more effectively by annexation than in any other way. So for Revels, the blessings of American liberty, Republican ideals, Christian civilization, all these should be exported to the Caribbean by the United States. And so Revels sees moral and social reasons for annexation, along with strategic reasons and economic reasons, and he defies his friendship with Sumner, and the treaty is sent to a vote. The vote is 28-28. That's a loss in the Senate, for sure. And that essentially is the end of Grant's attempt to annex to Santo Domingo, although if you buy the book, you'll read some of the postscript as to what happens next. Please buy the book. At this point, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass is splitting with Charles Sumner as well. If Mr. Sumner shall persevere in his present policy, Frederick Douglass said, I shall consider his opposition fractious and regard him as the worst foe the colored race has on this continent. This position this annexation attempt ruined relationships and friendships among the former abolitionists. There are many other Republicans who oppose expansion in the Caribbean, but they also oppose Grant's efforts at Reconstruction in the South, particularly his support for African American rights and equality. They cast Dominican annexation in the same light as attempting to move African Americans into the political sphere. They're led by Missouri Senator Carl Schurz, and Schurz argues that African American freedom was the only goal of the Civil War, not equality. Schurz would later establish the Liberal Republican Party as a direct challenge to Grant and his quest for African American rights, and as a pushback against what he saw as governmental overreach and corruption through the Reconstruction process. So Schurz and the other liberal Republicans question, why should they give Dominicans citizenship when the former slaves, he claims, aren't up to the task of being citizens even in the South? To these liberal Republicans, Reconstruction ended once the Southern states returned to the Union. There's no need to add additional, as they saw it, quote, uneducated and unrepublican people into the citizenry, when the Southern states were struggling to incorporate freedmen into their own electorates. So these racist ideals fly into the face of the way that Grant believes things, yet they're all members of the same party. And so the Liberal Republican Party, led by Schurz, connects with Charles Sumner, and they lead the effort in 1872 to defeat Grant by nominating Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley loses really badly and dies 2 days after the election, so he wouldn't have been president anyway, probably. So Reconstruction saw the implementation of important civil rights legislation that outlawed slavery, made birthright citizenship constitutionally protected, and secured the right to vote for African American men, but these changes didn't happen immediately, right? These are the result of significant political upheaval and challenging the rights of freedmen and things like that. So President Grant and his administration undertake to transition the United States through this transformation by managing the rights of citizens and by attempting to incorporate new citizens into the nation, right? And increasing the reach of republicanism in the Western Hemisphere. Now, white Republicans view these efforts as intended to strengthen the reunified nation, but Black Americans and their allies view these efforts as instigating revolutionary political change. So Grant's political enemies and even some of his supposed allies resist these attempts at revolutionary change, at bringing new citizens in the United States, and it eventually fractures the Republican Party. So Reconstruction in the South continues, and violence towards African Americans begins to rise as the former Confederates attempt to wrest control from the Republican-dominated legislatures. And here in Mississippi, tensions come to a boil in 1875. When whites utilize intimidation and violence to overwhelmingly keep African Americans from voting. This violence leads to the former Confederates retaking the legislature, retaking a number of local political positions. And this violence leads Grant to lament to Mississippi Governor Adelbert Ames, quote, I suggest that you take all lawful means and all needed measures to preserve the peace by the force in your own state. Let the country see the citizens of Mississippi have the courage and manhood to fight for their rights. So unfortunately, Ames is unable to prevent that violence because he's not getting any support from the federal government. And the Democrats succeed in winning a majority of the political offices. So congressional investigations are held about what happened in Mississippi, but these prove fruitless as one former member of the United States Senate agrees to testify on behalf of the white Democrats, and that former member was Hiram Revels. So Grant must have been shocked when he received a letter from Hiram Revels in November of 1875 that advocated for the Southern Democrats. Revels charged the Republicans in the state had misled African Americans who were, quote, enslaved in mind by unprincipled adventurers who, caring nothing for country, were willing to stoop to anything, no matter how infamous, to secure power for themselves and perpetuate it. And by that he means Governor Ames. Revels charged that African Americans in Mississippi had realized they were, quote, being used as mere tools. Revels charged the Republican administration in the state, and basically Ames, with being, quote, notoriously corrupt and dishonest, and that men, irrespective of race, color, or party affiliation, united and voted together against men who were incompetent and dishonest. Any animosity was not the fault of the people of Mississippi, Revels wrote. Quote, the bitterness and hate created by the late civil strife has now been obliterated in this state. Revels' assessment of the political situation in Mississippi was completely wrong and inaccurate. If anything, white Mississippians' bitterness towards the Republican Party and the federal government was increasing, not being obliterated. Historians have argued, quote, that Revels' support of the Democrats was simply revenge against Ames and the rest of the Republican Party for ousting him for the presidency at Alcorn University. Or that Revels sided with the Democrats in order to secure his old position at Alcorn again from a friendly administration. Now, while both of these conclusions are certainly possible, Revels' letter was not really out of character nor not in line with his political ideology. As a member of the United States Senate, Revels introduced numerous petitions on behalf of white Southerners, and even supported legislation that would allow the reinstitution of political rights for former Confederates. His Christian faith led him to support Grant's annexation scheme, and it certainly could have guided him in his dealings with white Mississippians. When he put forth legislation that asked for magnanimity towards white Southerners, Frederick Douglass surmised that, quote, Revels is an amiable man. He's always been free, though, and has perhaps not a stripe on his back. Such men are apt to find it easy to forget stripes laid on other men's backs and can just as easily exhort themselves to forget them. So Revels' support of the Democrats against the Republican government was a blow to Grant's efforts in the South. Rampant violence and intimidation occurred so frequently that Grant grew impatient with the response in Mississippi, stating, quote, the whole public are tired out with these annual autumnal outbreaks of violence in the South. In the final year of his presidency, Grant was unable to convince his cabinet that the lives of the freedmen mattered. As historian William McFeely put it, by the summer of 1876, there was no one in the White House who gave a damn about black people. Grant worried about the plight of African Americans, but not enough to do anything about it by the end, having lost the chance at annexing Santo Domingo, lost Revels to the influence of Democrats in Mississippi. But in his final annual message to Congress, Grant laments the lost opportunity in Santo Domingo. This violence that's happening in 75 and 76, Grant envisioned this in 1869, saying, quote, in cases of great oppression and cruelty such as has been practiced upon them in many places, whole communities of African Americans could have sought refuge in the Dominican Republic. The possession of this territory would have let the Negro master of the situation, enabling him to demand his rights at home on pain of finding them elsewhere. Historian Heather Cox Richardson argues that what we know as Reconstruction is often being defined as the era of citizenship, when Americans defined who would be citizens and what that citizenship meant. This is precisely what the Grant administration tackled during Reconstruction, not merely as a function of their foreign policy, but as part of the overall policy. The Grant Doctrine was an attempt, though a failed one, to redefine the U.S.'s place in the world, and an attempt to redefine how American citizens function within that world. The United States Congress drafted the Reconstruction Amendments to provide measures of equal rights for African Americans. And with these amendments, this altered our Constitution fundamentally. Grant chose to interpret them as tools for incorporating people into the Republican experiment. And without these amendments, these marginalized people would never have been in the conversation to begin with in the United States. But at the same time, he's utilizing outdated or racist Western notions of civilization to determine who's even fit to be a citizen. Many of his initiatives fail, but it's important to remember that these Reconstruction amendments still live on in our Constitution, right? Grant's attempt to incorporate new people into the citizenry did not die when his policies failed. African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants have all continued to fight white supremacy for their equal rights throughout the 19th, 20th, and into the 21st century. So these ideals behind the Grant Doctrine, free labor, destroying slavery in the Western Hemisphere, expanding citizenship to non-whites, these live on in our American consciousness. Thank you. Now, I think there's a little time for questions. If you have a question, if you can raise your hand and he'll get the microphone to you.
Is there any record of how the Dominicans felt about being annexed?
There is. So like anything, there are plenty of people who are for annexation. There are plenty of people who are against it. So obviously the Dominican leadership is for it because they're the ones who brought the idea to Grant to begin with. The problem is the Dominicans were just about a year out of their own civil war, only about 5 years out of getting their freedom from Spain. They're constantly at war with Haiti. There are constant raids over the mountains with Haiti. So there's just a lot of turmoil going on. So there's no way to get a consensus. And when Grant asks for a plebiscite, a vote, yay or nay, it comes back overwhelmingly for annexation, and anyone who's anyone knows that it's a complete farce of a vote. There are a few riots that happen, but when he sends a committee down, which includes Frederick Douglass goes into the countryside to meet individuals, regular people, not just the higher-ups, and many of them, he comes back agreeing that annexation is a good idea, it's good for the Dominicans, there are several who want it. There's also a colony of former African-American slaves who fled the United States and moved to the Dominican Republic and created their own little subculture down there, who want desperately to join back with the United States. They've been down there for about 20, 30 years. Now that slavery is ended, they want to be Americans again, but they also now have a life down there, and so being Americans in the Dominican Republic to them is a great idea. So it's one of those situations where, yes, some people want, some people don't. It's just like in the United States. It's probably about 50-50 in the United States. It's probably about 50-50 in the Dominican Republic. And it didn't happen. And so, you know, one of those things.
Thank you. Thank you for that brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
My question is in a way connected to the previous question, because Santo Domingo, the Grant's proposal to deal with, to annex Santo Domingo and Cuba and Puerto Rico, these are all colonies of Spain. And to be able to deal with these colonies, you have to deal with Spain. I don't see how he is going to be able to annex any of these Spanish colonies without dealing with Spain.
Sure.
And the other thing is the South, the American South, the Confederacy, is where you have mostly a large majority of blacks. And the South is very sympathetic towards good relationships with Spain, which is has a lot of blacks as well. So it's good for the South to have good relationships, which is going to be able to enable them to strengthen their slave sympathies.
Sure. So I'll take them one colony at a time. By this point in 1869, the Dominican Republic is not a colony of Spain. They are an independent nation. They're a republic. And so as leaders of that republic, they have reached out to Grant about annexation, going through the constitutional process to be annexed to the United States. So the Dominican Republic is its own nation. They've come to Grant, and so he thinks that's fine. What's happening in Cuba at this time is there's a rebellion, a revolution basically happening known as the 10-year, well, we now know as the 10 Years' War, which is former enslaved people, planters, farmers, all rising up against Spanish rule, right? And many Americans, particularly Cuban Americans, naturalized citizens, are going back there to fight. His friend, John Rollins, who died right before the end of the year, John Rollins wants us to go and fight down there. He wants us to support because it is a revolutionary, it is an American revolution that's happening to end slavery. Grant has no desire to get physically involved in that. His way he thinks of ending that is by choking slavery. The reason why slavery is still profitable is because the United States buys all its coffee and its oranges and its sugar from Cuba. If you can grow coffee, oranges, and sugar in the Dominican Republic, which is American territory now, you don't spend that money in Cuba. Slavery is not profitable. They have to end slavery, or the enslaved then flee to the Dominican Republic and join the United States. At the same time, there's a revolution happening in Spain. They've deposed Queen Isabella, right? General Prim is now in charge in Spain. So there's so much chaos in Spain, so much chaos in Cuba. And then you've got Puerto Rico off to the side that's caught up in all of the mix, still with their enslaved. At one point in the negotiations with Spain, the Spanish offered to just give us Cuba and Puerto Rico and whitewash their hands of it all. And Grant says, no. We're not purchasing them. They have to come. Grant has this belief that people have to come to the United States of their own accord. He believes that the Dominicans are. Again, are they really? Well, the leaders certainly are. Charles Sumner wants Canada. Charles Sumner has decided that the British owe us so much money for supporting the Confederates during the Civil War, they ought to just give us Canada. And Grant says, if Canadians want to be American, they're welcome to ask, but we're not taking Canada from Great Britain. We're not taking Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain. But if they want to come, that's fine. But they're not coming right now because they're in the middle of a war and a rebellion amongst themselves, and we're spending too much time of our own people and money going down there. So all of it is very confusing. But at one point, Spain actually offers to just give us, essentially, because it was like $100,000, which at that point, even then, was nothing for two island nations, to just give us, the United States, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, to basically wash their hands of the whole situation. And this war continues on for many years in Cuba. And, you know, should we have gotten involved in it? Yes, we should have. But then that whole complicated thing with read the book. There's a whole thing in there about if we got involved in Cuba, then we would have undermined our own argument about the British getting involved in our Civil War. Because we're saying, you got to stay out of these things. Well, we can't go get involved in another civil war just a couple years later and expect to have any kind of moral argument. Because the British owed us $15 million, and we wanted that. So.
I'm going to go to the stage. I'm going to come up there, Ryan, if you don't mind. Just got a special announcement that I need to make.
Sure.
I don't know if all of you guys know, but Chris Goodwin is retiring. And so this is his last History's Lunch, and I was asked to just share a few words about Chris and the work that he's done with the department for a long time. Chris joined the department in April of 2001 as a public relations representative and was later named Director of Public Information. In this role, he managed the department's websites, oversaw publications, distributed promotional materials, and built relationships with the statewide media. He provided staff assistance to the Mississippi Historical Society and served as the managing editor of the Journal of Mississippi History. For more than 20 years, Chris has been an integral member of our communications team. In 2019, with the opening of the two museums, the public information section was reorganized into the Programs and Communication Division, and Chris continued to lead one of the department's most loved programs, History's Lunch. This program was conceived by William Winter and led for many years by Chrissy Wilson. Many of you may remember when History's Lunch was held in the orientation room at the William Winter building, where we were bursting at the seams. When the museums opened, History's Lunch moved to its new home here in December of 2017. And year after year, Chris has elevated this program, consistently bringing exceptional authors, musicians, researchers, and storytellers to the stage. At its best, History's Lunch reflects Chris's wide-ranging interests, familiarity with the book world, and strong network of connections. We are deeply grateful for Chris's public relations experience, creativity, relationship building skills, and dedication to this and many other programs. His efforts have set a high standard for this program, which will continue to thrive under that legacy. So with that said, please join me in thanking Chris for his many years of service here at MDAH. Thank you, Chris. This concludes our program. The author, Ryan, has books for sale over to the right here, and he'll be glad to answer any questions that we didn't get to before the end. Thank you.
Thank you all.